Today I'll be talking about literary tradition and literary influence. I think no writer is original. I think we're all derivative. Our work's shaped by the works that we've read and reread and loved and ingested, and shaped also by languages we've studied, the language backgrounds we were born into. So shaped by all these things, and I have to admit that I also, in addition to being derivative and not original, I have no idea what I'm doing when I'm writing. I actually don't know what will happen in any of my books as I'm writing. I write without an outline or a plan, and I have no idea what they're about, even. I usually find out in the last 50 pages or so. So, to me, how literary influence happens is a very interesting subject. How it is that the book does come together, how it is that there does end up being some structure to it. So, to start off with, when I was in writing classes at Stanford and writing programs, I was always told that writing was about control, that it was mostly revision, 95% revision. You would have outlines and plans and ideas, and all of that ended up not being true for me. When I wrote Sukwon Island, the novella in Legend of a Suicide, I had a plan, and that was that my father's suicide would be at the end of it. I thought that I would get closer to understanding his final moments and understand his despair, because I'd been kind of wimpy in the stories. I felt I didn't get close enough to him. So that was my plan, but halfway through, the boy kills himself instead of the father, and that was a radical change to my plan, really detonated the story as I saw it and what it was supposed to be. And so the next day I went back and I planned to cut that moment and continue on with my plan. But rereading all those pages, about 80 pages or so, it was a very strange experience. It was like seeing them for the first time, as if someone else had written the pages, as if I wasn't the author. Suddenly I could see all this pattern and pressure that was leading to that moment. And that changed my view of writing forever. After that, I understood that the unconscious mind has more pattern to it, more shape than my conscious mind, at least. And what I've come to understand over time is that it's not just my unconscious, it's literary tradition that's making all of that shape and pattern also, and language study. So Dirt and Goat Mountain are my last two novels. Most recent is Goat Mountain. And they're both Greek tragedies. This isn't something that I intended to do when I started writing the books. I didn't know that I was going to be writing Greek tragedies. But the Greek tragedies have been with us for 2,500 years. And we know how to read that form, and we know how to write it also. It's buried in us. And it seems to me that everything that the Greeks knew is still relevant today. They knew, for instance, that the basic relationships that make up our lives, our relationship to our parents, to our siblings, our marriages, to our children, that those basic relationships shape us and can also break us. And in Greek tragedy, a paired relationship, such as father-son that I wrote about in Legend of Suicide, or mother-son in Dirt, or marriage in Caribou Island, that relationship was put under pressure in drama, in tragedy, until the characters break. And in the moment they break, they're revealed. We see their goodness and their badness, and we can test ourselves against them. That's the tradition we have for 2,500 years, and readers still know how to do that, how to respond to that, even if they're not actually thinking consciously about Greek tragedy at all. The other thing great about the Greeks, is that these characters are acting out of control unconsciously. So the main question in Greek tragedy is, why do we hurt the people we love? All these characters act out of control, and the people who are closest to them, who they love the most, those are the people they end up hurting. That's why it's tragedy. And that's what I've been writing in all of my books. And it made sense that Dirt and Goat Mountain would get much closer to that form, to being like a play, in that every moment is dramatized in scene, and there's something close to dramatic unities where the rest of the world's been excluded. It takes place, Goat Mountain takes place in just 2.5 days on a mountainside with 4 characters. You know, it's very focused. The difference, of course, is that between my work and Greek tragedy is that all of my work is told through landscape, through the place. That's my mode, is to describe the place, and the story comes from that. And you can't do that on stage. You don't have landscape description on stage. So that is another tradition I'm influenced by, an American landscape tradition. The best example of this tradition is Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. It's a brutal and violent book, but it's also the strongest example of what it is that tradition is about, which is that you take literal landscapes and extend them into figurative landscapes to get meaning and theme. So he describes mountains on the sudden skyline, stark and black and livid, like a land of some other order out there, whose true geology was not stone but fear. And it's that movement from stone to fear that went from the literal concrete, mountains to an abstract figurative landscape. And it's all those moments taken together when we extend that we get vision and theme, that we find out what the book is about. So I'm writing out of that tradition. When I describe the landscape, it's essentially a Rorschach test. It's like an ink blot drawing where you see shapes in it, even though it's actually just random ink blot. When I describe forest or the mountains or the ocean, it's like that. It takes on shape and pattern in a way that surprises me, that's unconscious, and that shows the inside life of the characters, starts to create those characters. And that's the landscape becoming crazy, changing shape, shifting a bit, and starting to become this figurative landscape, this other landscape that becomes vision. So to me, that's entirely how writing works, actually. And I think that that's the best thing about the American literary tradition, is that focus in rural and regional writing on that focus on the landscape. There's another tradition I write out of, which is that it's just a literary form, the novella. What's strange about this is that no one really knows about the novella. So my novel Caribou Island is a novel, but Dirt and Goat Mountain are not novels. They're about 250 pages, 60,000 words, so they're long enough to be novels, and they're always marketed as that, and we think of as that, and they're reviewed as novels, but they're not. They're novellas because of the pacing, the language, and the dramatic structure. In Dirt, for instance, there's a point of crisis halfway through, and then a point of crisis at the end. And most of the world has been excluded. There's only 5 characters. You don't get a break from the primary dramatic action between those 2 main characters, and you don't do what you do in a novel where you go off into someone else's story for a while and get a little break. You don't have a larger world. You don't have a whole series of crises leading to something. Instead, it really kind of divides into 2, like Catherine Ann Porter's Noon Wine, which divides into 2, the second crisis being a consequence of the first one. And the language and pacing being that of a short story and a small cast of characters and located in one place. Other examples would be Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy, Melville's short novels, Flannery O'Connor's Displaced Person, which was actually 2 short stories just spliced together to form a novella. So it's a wonderful literary form. I love it, and it bums me out a bit that no one really knows about it. And it bums me out a little bit that when my books are reviewed, no one ever really knows what the deal is. No one's ever said, this is Greek tragedy written out of a landscape tradition, and it's actually a novella, and it's written using Old English, like paired heavy stresses and stuff like that. That review is my dream review, and it's never going to happen. So to that next point, the Old English and paired heavy stresses, I've translated Beowulf, which is a long poem. It's like 3,100 lines. And I wanted a long project that would be a daily immersion. It's been 2 years of spending about half an hour each day on Old English. I wanted a long immersion in the language. It's very beautiful. It sounds like Hwat, Wegardena, in Yer Dagum, Thead Köninge, Thrymje Frunen, Hutha Eithlingas, Ellen Fremedon. You can hear the paired stresses. Hutha Eithlingas, Ellen Fremedon. Offshield Shefin, Shiadan Athreatum, Monogum Medum, Meoda Setla of Teach, Exida Erla, Sithan Erust Werth, Fiashaft Funden, Hethas Frofra Yabad, Weax under Wolknum, Werthmundum Tha, Othat Eilwich there im Sittendra of a Hromrada Huren Scholda Gomban Gulden, that was God König. So at the end you can understand that was God König, that was a good king. But a lot of the other stuff you're not going to understand because it's a Germanic language going back we're not sure when it was composed. It might have been composed in the 800s and have been about a story from the 500s, but we're not sure. And it's a Germanic language where we've lost about 60% of the vocabulary, so we don't really have it much. But what we do still have are those paired heavy stresses. We still use that meter, and it still influences a lot of writers. And we still know how to read it as readers. Even if we've never studied Old English, we know that if we get those paired stresses to end a section, that there's been emphasis. So in Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, she ends the first section with our hovering faces and our cold hands. The second paragraph of Annie Proulx's The Shipping News is hive-spangled, gut-roaring, with gas and cramp. He survived childhood. That whole paragraph's like that. The end of it is, he liked a ham knuckle, buttered spuds. Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian has this one section of a massacre that's just endless paired stresses. I don't have that one memorized. It's something like, I don't know. It's these frenzied ponies and such. It's an impossible one. But we're still using this meter. I mean, what's exciting to me is that it's still alive from more than 1,000 years ago. It's still very important and still alive in American fiction, at least. And I suspect I found it in some other writers here, like especially dense prose stylists, like Carrie Tiffany here, for instance, who writes really beautiful prose. It's a higher level of cohesion in her prose. You're more likely to find those kinds of things. So the other side of our language is Latin. And I've just started studying that again. The best thing I ever did for my writing was to take Latin. So if there are any aspiring writers, that's my advice. Go take a Latin workshop. It was an intensive where in 5 weeks we learned 1,000 words and all the grammar, which just about killed me. It was 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then for the next 5 weeks we read 10 authors in the original. But it transformed my sense of grammar and also of style. In Latin, there's much more that's possible in style. It's a more flexible and more marked language. We can only say the cat bit the dog or the dog bit the cat, but in Latin you can specify who was bit in the word itself, so you can arrange the words wherever you'd like. And you also have greater range when Cicero's on the attack against Catiline. He says, "You sewer rat, get out of town." When he's on the defense, there are these long swirling sentences. It's very hard to locate the verbs. It's hard to know how to come back and argue against it because you can't understand the sentence that's happening. So anyway, you see a greater variation. And it's nice to see what's buried in our English now. When I say I go to the store to buy some milk, it's an "ook" clause. I go to the store in order that I might buy some milk. It's nice to know what's buried under our syntax now, what the transformations have been. As a writer, I think you can be more flexible with that. And also, I just think it's beautiful. I think Latin's really beautiful. And it's a distinctly different meter than Old English. It's accentual syllabic. We had the paired heavy stresses in Old English. It didn't actually matter how many syllables we had. But in Latin, it does. So you have arma, veramque, cano. So the dactylic hexameter, arma, where is a dactyl, heavy stress, and then 2 soft stresses. So it's a number of syllables. It's a stress pattern. It's a much more ornate poetry. English is the best language to write in. Now, we have the biggest vocabulary in the world, and we're the collision of 2 languages. It was when the French invaded, 1066, Battle of Hastings. We got this fantastic double vocabulary and double metrical scheme, and it's also a marked language according to class. So everything high class is Latin or French, everything low class is German. So it's cow when it's out in the field, it's beef when it lands on your plate. It's really nice to have a class stratified language. I mean, it's fantastic. The most beautiful the English language has ever been was Middle English. And that's because that was when these 2 languages that collided combined, and they were still intact. We still had both of them. So I'll just finish with a bit of the opening of the Canterbury Tales. And listen to the stress pattern here. It's supposed to be iambic pentameter. Let's see. I'm trying to find the line that is that. So I have to do the first couple lines. Juan de Rapro, with a sure de sota, the drucht of March hath passed to the rota, and ba the dev revine and switch the cur. That's the iambic pentameter. It's supposed to be in ba the dev revine and switch the cur. But he's running paired stresses over the rest of it. So he's he's favoring the older meter, Old English. It's the first great work in the vernacular in English, not in Latin or French, and he's also favoring the older pattern, metrical pattern, just as Annie Proulx does. So to just hear the rest of those lines, and listen to the sounds too. Juan is when, but it's aspirated still, the hua sound. And we have drucht for drought. We still have the GH sounded from German. It's knicht in shining armor, not a knight. And we have the French sounds, engendred and fleur. So, Juan de Rapro with the Shure Sota, the Drucht of March hath passed to the Rota, and bad at every veen and switch the cour, of which vertu engendred is the floor, Juan Zephyr sake with the sweat of breath, and spirit hath and every halt and hath the tender cropus, and the younge sunne hath in the ram is half course urunne, and smalle foolings makkeln melodie, that slepen of the nicht with open ear, so pricketh them nature and heer courages, dan langen folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmers for to sake and stranges strondes, to fair in the hallways, couth and sondry londes. And then it kind of falls off in the poetry, and especially from every sheerest end of Canterbury to when the holy blissful Martha for to sake at the time of Holtman Van that they were sake. So it's like, it goes into kind of just pedestrian prose at the end. But the first part is so beautiful, and that's when you get to hear our literary tradition all combined into the one language. So for me, studying these two languages every day and writing out of these literary traditions means that when I write unconsciously, there's actually a lot of pattern, there are a lot of echoes, and studying it means that I'm more likely to be able to use these things rather than being used by them, and that's my main reason for studying it.